Okay, let's dive in. Greetings, everyone. We're going to start the webinar now. Thank you all for joining us. First, I want to thank Missy Courier, Ricky Seguin, and Arcelia Sayas for being our panelists today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves by way of their background, organization, and what drives the passion behind what they do every day. I don't like to ask this of people unless I'm willing to do it myself. So here goes nothing. My name is Ben Callahan. I'm co-founder of Read New Mexico. How did I get here? Well, I've spent the last 15 years or so working to help residents across the country understand what renewable energy projects can do for them and their local communities, and also what kind of impacts there are in their local communities. Read New Mexico allows me to expand that public engagement on a statewide level, really. I'm passionate about learning the questions and value people see when renewable energy projects are proposed in their local area. I certainly see a lot of benefit, but I know there are a lot of questions. This drives really what I do every day. Being on the front lines, bringing more economic development, job opportunities, and additional support to local government, schools, and other community needs brings a lot of satisfaction to my daily life. And my hope is those communities in which I work. So I'm going to turn to Missy to introduce herself for a minute or two. Thanks, Missy.
Thanks, Ben. We're glad to be here today. My name is Missy Courier, and I work for the Economic Development Corporation of Lee County. For those that may not know, Lee County is in the southeastern corner of the state. We're right in the middle of the Permian Basin, right next to the Texas border. We are part of the Energyplex, and we're proud to be the Energyplex in Lee County, focusing on all different types of energy, of course, including renewables, oil and gas, nuclear options, and other ways that we continue to power the region, the state, and ultimately the world. I'm glad to be here with you all today, and thanks for the time, Ben.
Thanks, Missy. Ricky.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ben, for having me. My name is Ricky Seguin, and I work as the executive director of an organization called the Interwest Energy Alliance. Interwest is the regional trade association for utility scale wind, solar, storage developers and manufacturers. So we're based here in New Mexico. You'll have to apologize. As many of you know, it's trash day in Albuquerque, which makes it always pretty loud. So you may hear interference at some point, but I'm based in downtown Albuquerque, and our organization covers 6 states, legislative and regulatory affairs for renewable energy generators around the West. For me, my passion and why I am here every day is I am deeply motivated by the changing climate and acting in every way we can to mitigate the problems and the changes that we are causing. I see renewable energy as being this real opportunity to make a difference on climate while simultaneously investing in some of the most rural parts of our state and our country, bringing good jobs to people who need them, and putting us on the cutting edge of technology development. So grateful to be here and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Ricky. Really appreciate your time. And Arcelia, how about a few words from you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ben. As you said, my name is Arcelia Isais Gastelum, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager with Read New Mexico, as well as the new campaign manager for our Rural Jobs Now campaign. And I've always just been personally drawn to renewable energy because I have seen it as a means of addressing our climate crisis, while also not compromising our standard of living. I started out advocating for better renewable energy policies, both at the state and local level a few years ago, and was actually very lucky to be involved with the campaign for the Energy Transition Act. And now that we have these policies in place, I've switched gears to focusing more on the implementation side, which has involved project development and having conversations with people about the benefits that come from bringing renewable energy development into our communities. And right now I'm excited to be taking the lead on this campaign and also excited to talk about it later.
Thanks, Arcelia. Good to have you on with the panel today, and of course as a strong member of our team. Really appreciate it. Before I kick off the questions to our panelists, I'd like to talk a little bit about who Read New Mexico is and the importance of this conversation with New Mexicans across the state. Read New Mexico is a statewide coalition of community and economic development public health, environmental, and social support organizations, residents, stakeholders who strive to create sustainable energy future in New Mexico, particularly through renewable energy project development. In recent years, New Mexico has demonstrated real national leadership in transitioning to a clean energy economy, which will provide long-term economic stability as well as growth and protecting our enchanted lands for future generations to enjoy. We acknowledge New Mexico's history as an energy and natural resources rich state and believe adding more renewable energy projects and other energy sources is really the right way to go. As we have learned to grapple with the many challenges this past year, we wanted to take this opportunity to stop and take a look at where we stand with developing renewable energy across the state and where we're headed in the future. But first, we want to thank our fellow New Mexicans for persevering during this pandemic and engaging like never before on important issues like this to keep the momentum going. Just a few other comments. Commercial wind and solar projects are already helping keep family members and ranchers on the land in New Mexico, creating family wage and above average wage jobs and new revenue for local schools and public services, while generating enough electricity to power more than 700,000 homes. New transmission is also part of the importance and part of the infrastructure, and that's on the way in New Mexico as well, including the Western Spirit project that will enable over $1.5 billion of new renewable generation that would not otherwise be built due to limitations of the existing electric transmission grid. But we hope this only scratches the surface really for wind and solar potential in New Mexico and other sources of energy. I'd like to bring back Missy into the conversation. Missy is a real leader working in the trenches of local economic development, diversifying the local economy in Lee County and making sure Lee County residents always have economic and employment options in that part of the state. It hasn't been easy, I know, but I know Missy is up to the challenge, and we're thankful that Renew Mexico calls Lee County Economic Development Corporation a partner. Missy, so I read on your website recently that wind, solar, and other renewable energy industries have an average salary of $77,272. First of all, that's great. Can you take a few minutes to talk about Lee County as this energy plex? I love that term. What does that mean for those viewing and listening today? And how has the renewable energy industry become of that part of that energy plex?
Sure. Well, we are very proud, as I mentioned earlier, to be known as the Energy Plex. And we're not only proud to be known as the Energy Plex, but we're even more proud to operate as the Energy Plex. One of the studies that we recently had done at the beginning of the pandemic, as we were trying to have a better understanding of who our essential workers are, in Lee County alone, over 60% of our residents are considered essential. That's because they're working in the energy sector, that's because they're working in construction and working in other industries that are not only important to southeastern New Mexico, but all of the state as a whole. There are so many of Lee County's assets that bring opportunities to the rest of New Mexico, whether that's generating money for the gross revenue tax, whether that's oil and gas severance funds, whether that's opportunities for workers to continue to contribute with the money that they're spending in hotels or at our local restaurants or shopping for their wives or whatever it might be. The reason I bring up the shopping for the wives is I saw an ad this morning that we're only 10 days or so away from Christmas, and I had a complete panic attack. So with that in mind, I got a little off topic there, but with all of the money that is being spent in those regions, that's where we really want to focus to continue to build off the idea of the Energy Plex. As we all know, Lee County is very much focused and traditionally been focused on oil and gas, but we're also very excited about the opportunity to continue to bring in other opportunities for energy production as we build out the grid, as we find new ways for infrastructure to evolve, as we find new ways to diversify the economy. With so much of our economy in southeastern New Mexico focused on oil and gas, we know that we really need to shift to renewables for several reasons. One reason, of course, is the economy, finding ways to better stabilize so we're not always just riding the boom and bust of the oil and gas cycle, but also for the importance of ensuring that our environment is better protected and that we have a long time to continue to stay and enjoy the riches of southeastern New Mexico. For those of you that have been to our region, you know that the sun shines constantly and the wind blows all the time. And the more that we can do to better harness those resources, to utilize them for the comforts that we've all come to enjoy through energy production, is something that we're very interested in. And finally, one of the things that we're very excited on and focused is New Mexico has not always done a very good job of keeping our assets in state. And what I mean by that is we're traditionally an export state. So whether we're harnessing oil and gas, or whether we're utilizing wind and solar and other natural resources, we've typically shipped those products out of state to be manufactured and utilized in other regions. So the more that we can keep in state and finding ways to produce more within our climate or within our environment and within New Mexico, that's going to provide more opportunities for tax revenue as well as keeping folks employed. And that's why we're very excited to be part of the Energyplex and the ways that we'll continue to diversify and build off oil and gas, as well as the renewables, recognizing all of those energy types can complement each other.
Appreciate that, Missy. You know, I'm a little bit of a local government geek, and I went to school for it before I kind of started my career. And as we really started this, Re New Mexico effort, and we were organizing our coalition, if anybody's visited our website or has talked with us, many of our partners are local economic development corporations from around the state. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of geek out on reading those local government, economic development corporation plans that you all put together. I know they take a lot of time. They're really intensive, but there were two things that just kept sticking out to me in each and every one of them, which was diversity and resiliency. And I think those two things and all the planning that folks like you do in local economic development around the state have really paid off, particularly during a pandemic, because it has really tested local governments, industry, our economy, to make sure that if one thing gets shut down, even temporarily, there's something else that's helping with jobs and the economy on the other side of the equation, and also just making those communities a lot more resilient over the long term. So really appreciate what you do and what you're doing. And we're glad to see Lee County continuing to make progress. I'm gonna switch over to Ricky. Really happy to have Ricky with us today. Interwest is one of our partners at Re New Mexico as well. In fact, one of our first partners, and thank you very much, Ricky, for being an early adopter. She's been a longtime advocate for clean energy policies. Interwest is active in collaborating with a lot of organizations around the state, but also the region, providing information that informs policy. Ricky, let's talk about the renewable energy economy a little bit and the job market in New Mexico and the other states that you cover as well. So what are you finding?
Well, thanks, Ben, again for having me, and we've been happy to be a longtime Renew Mexico supporter. It's interesting when you look at the population of New Mexico and you look at the electricity demand in the state, and you compare that to the renewable energy facilities already in the ground and then the potential. It's really, I think, amazing to see that a state with a smaller population than our neighbors has some of the greatest potential for generation of renewables and for the employment that comes with that. So when I talk about generation, renewable generation, I'm talking from my perspective and with the hat I wear, big scale wind, big scale solar. But in addition to that, we also need to think about the transmission lines that get built to bring the power from these facilities to the utilities and to customers. And those pieces are really important to connect together, that when we're talking about building more renewables, we also need to be talking about the transmission grid, which quickly makes people's eyes glaze over because it is objectively less fun to talk about, but I'm happy to do it if we want to go there. It's good to see already in New Mexico, wind and solar companies have invested over $5 billion today, 5 billion with a B. And they are eager to continue to invest. They are eager to continue to be a part of the diversification of the state economy. And I think we see ourselves as being an important part of the future of the state and how the state recovers from a very challenging economic crisis. Some highlights that I would mention from this year: in the May report from the Legislative Finance Committee, they showed how gross receipts tax collections varied in New Mexico counties from the last fiscal year in 2019 into 2020. And the narrative that we all know is how the state and counties are struggling for obvious reasons in light of the pandemic, as well as historically low oil prices. But what we saw there is that a couple of New Mexico counties are actually bringing in more GRT dollars, gross receipts tax dollars, than last year. And the report specifically calls out both Roosevelt and Torrance counties as bringing in more dollars this year, and they attribute that to wind construction. So continuing to build these large-scale facilities during the pandemic and during these challenging times has been a real boon to both state and local budgets. Another, I think, highlight that I saw this summer in August, Rio Arriba County noted that they avoided any major budget cuts for their next fiscal year because of a new solar project that was coming into Rio Arriba County. So we want to be part of the solution. We're able to invest dollars locally and at the state level and keep New Mexicans working at a time when we all know how much various industries have been impacted by this pandemic. So I know as we talk today, we'll talk about what that growth potential looks like and how we continue to unlock more opportunities to build projects in the state. But that's a commitment that we're making as our companies want to continue to do business here in New Mexico and make sure that those benefits are realized here in the state. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ricky. Really appreciate that. You mentioned transmission. At New Mexico, we do, we spend 90% of our time doing outreach and, to residents across the state, no matter what part of the state. And to your point about transmission, there couldn't be something so necessary, but so mundane in some ways to people. There's nothing like picking up the phone and calling a voter in the state and saying, "Hi, I'd like to talk to you about transmission today." It's a little bit of an interesting icebreaker in terms of engaging people about these important issues, but it's still a necessary one, and which is a good segue to Arcelia, because the person who probably makes most of those calls and has engaged most of the voters across the state for New Mexico is Arcelia. She's been super busy talking to New Mexicans in all parts of the state about project development and transmission, how it impacts their local communities, and based on getting all of that feedback and input, we gave Arcelia the job of taking this Rural Jobs Now initiative and really moving it forward. So I want to turn to Arcelia now and just have her talk a little bit about, what has she heard? What have you heard, Arcelia, from folks in communities all across the state about providing rural jobs through renewable energy projects and transmission? Any introductory remarks you'd like to share with the group today?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Like Ben said, we've done a lot of phone outreach these past few months. We've been talking to residents about projects that are going on in their area, about upcoming legislation decisions to watch out for. And above all, we want to foster conversations about the renewable energy potential in our communities. So if you happen to see a 602 number calling you, I promise I'm not concerned about your car's extended warranty. I just really want to talk about renewable energy. So many of the people that I've spoken with are actually really happy to tell me about their 10-year-old individual solar systems or even wind turbines, and how they've been able to keep their electricity running even when the neighborhood is experiencing a blackout, or how much money they've saved over the years since first investing. And it's always really encouraging to me to hear these stories, because 10 years especially is an entire generation in technology time, especially for utility scale projects. Since 2009, the cost of utility scale solar and wind generation have dropped 90% and 71% respectively, even as the efficiency is expected to continue rising. So not only is it cheaper than ever to run, the economic benefits in rural communities is incredible. For example, 99% of wind capacity is located in rural areas. So these billions of dollars in investments and revenue and bringing the fastest growing job market in the country, all this would directly benefit the people in these communities. And like I mentioned earlier, the passage of the Energy Transition Act, which sets benchmarks for transitioning to 100% clean and renewable power by 2045, is expected to greatly contribute to this growing market. At 50% of our energy coming from renewable sources, we can expect to see nearly an 180% increase in the number of New Mexicans who are employed in the wind and solar industry. And this isn't including other potential markets related to renewable energy, like how Ricky mentioned, expanding our transmission infrastructure. And there's also potentially expanding to manufacturing of parts. And like what was mentioned, the wages for these jobs are above average, which is really important to making sure that our own students and younger generations are incentivized to stay here rather than look for work outside of the states. And even looking away from the direct jobs that would be brought, a recent workforce development study also found that the industrial scale wind and solar operations can completely revitalize rural communities by expanding the tax base. And this is why we launched our Rural Jobs Now campaign, which I'm very excited to be part of. There's still a lot of misconceptions about how renewable energy industries could benefit major cities versus rural areas. There's a lot of misconceptions that most of the jobs would go to more urbanized areas, which just isn't the case. That same study looked at 12 Midwestern states who have more prominent renewable markets than ours to get a sense of what we can expect to see here in New Mexico. And they found that 11 of the 12 states had a faster growth rate in clean energy jobs in rural areas compared to urban areas. And wind technicians and solar installers are among the fastest growing jobs in the country. And I myself have spoken with people who are employed in local solar companies across New Mexico, and they have told me that they're seeing a growing demand for systems, how they're seeing an expansion in their own companies just within the last few years. And they're still able to stay in business even with like all the craziness that was this year. So our goal is to address these misconceptions and to make sure that our rural communities aren't missing out on the soon to be exploding job market. And just personally, as someone who initially came from out of the state, I was really motivated to making sure that the people who really contribute to the sense of community and culture in the state are able to stay here, and not just stay here, but also thrive and flourish. But yeah, that's kind of a quick overview about how that's been going so far.
Thanks, Arcelia. I just want to add, something on the jobs front reinforces a few of your comments as well. We've done some polling along the path of our outreach to New Mexicans since New Mexico got started. And when asked, one of the top motivations for respondents was the ability of renewable energy jobs being able to pay 40% higher wages than other jobs in rural communities, and how that can provide the option for families to stay and work in communities that they have called home, to your point, Arcelia, rather than having to leave elsewhere for good paying jobs. Speaking of elsewhere, Ricky, I know you have some thoughts on transmission a little bit further, and New Mexico's role in renewable energy generation for other states. I see this as an issue of positively producing and exporting renewable energy to where it's needed outside New Mexico while keeping the benefits, dollars, and jobs here in the state. So what are your thoughts, and what could either accelerate this trend or what could also hamper those efforts moving forward?
Thanks, Ben. And I saw a question about this come in the chat, and I am trying to answer some as we go, but I know there's more than we can get to. This question about New Mexico renewables competing in a regional electricity market is kind of center to how I think about the opportunity. We should be proud of the leadership that leadership role New Mexico has stepped into with the passage of the Energy Transition Act in 2019, which commits the state to a 100% carbon-free future by 2045. But like I said a few minutes ago, the actual demand for electricity in the state is relatively small compared to that of the West. Not to get too technical, but the majority of New Mexico is part of the Western electric grid. And there are very few seams or opportunities to sell power east into the Eastern electric grid. So mostly when we think about moving power and competing in these regional electricity markets, primarily we're thinking about the Western United States. And in addition to the work that has happened here in New Mexico with the passage of the Energy Transition Act, similar laws have been passed all across the West. So as it stands right now, about 80% of the load in the West is aligned on decarbonization. What that means is that utilities and states are going to need to buy a lot of clean energy in order to meet the laws on the books today. The studies that are out there show it looks like about 9 gigawatts of new renewable generation per year, every year, from 2026 through about 2050. To put that number into perspective, the total installed renewables in New Mexico today is 3 gigawatts. So we're talking about 9 of those every year for about 25 years. So there's huge demand, there's huge opportunity to build those projects. And to your point with the question, Ben, how do we make sure those projects, or a large number of those, are built here in our state so we can have the jobs, the tax investment, the local dollars invested into our hardware stores, you name it? How do we get that here? So there are a few ways to do that, and there's no real silver bullet, as it were. New Mexico is really lucky in that we are well suited with high solar radiance. It's very sunny here, as Missy was saying, and it's also very windy. We happen to have both of those, and that makes us a desirable place to build these projects. But we also have a very competitive tax structure and permitting and siting requirements. Again, I apologize. I told you you'd hear that trash collector, and it's, as promised, it comes every time I'm speaking. The University of Wyoming put out a study that showed that New Mexico was the most competitive marketplace for building renewable energy facilities in the West. So it's sunny, it's windy, and it's competitive to build here. So in order for us to really capitalize on this big opportunity to build projects, we need to maintain that competitive advantage. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to stress this competitive nature of our electric system. With something like traditional resource extraction, Missy mentioned the Permian. We have the Permian here in New Mexico, and they don't have it in Colorado, and they don't have it in Nevada. When it comes to renewable electricity generation, as technology gets better, you can kind of build it in most places. So we're competing with all of our neighbors to build the generating facilities to supply that clean electricity that states need. So we need to remain competitive. 2 is we need to have the transmission to bring our renewable electricity to those markets across the West. And this gets to my 3rd point, but it's related to the 2nd, which is we need transmission, which is it's really hard to build transmission. It is expensive. It is hard to plan for. Utilities are thinking about their electric system, but all of those systems of different utilities need to connect together. And the way we do it in the West right now is pretty clunky and very different from how you see it around most of the country. So having a regional transmission operator, an RTO, is sort of code word for a more functional regional electricity market that will allow for better planning of transmission lines, smarter cost allocation to solve this question of who pays for it. And that will be key to unlocking these very competitive resources that we have in New Mexico and bringing them around the rest of the country. So I apologize if I got too in the weeds there, but that to us is key. Regional electricity markets and having this regional transmission operator to help with that are really quite critical. Thanks.
Thanks, Ricky. Really appreciate that. You know, that competitiveness thing, it can't be emphasized enough. You know, I know there have been conversations this past year leading into next year about the possibility of taxing renewable energy projects. We hope that is not something New Mexicans have to face in 2021. It's something we have communicated with our grassroots advocates about across the state the last few months, and we've gotten a super strong response from our grassroots advocates that it's not something they want to see. So, they're ready to engage on it. We hope that competitiveness can stay there and we're not hampered by those sorts of initiatives. But we'll see where things take us from here leading into next year. Missy, I want to come back to you. We've been talking about energy sector jobs quite a bit. I read this morning that while the state's financial picture might be better than expected, the state isn't expected to regain its pre-pandemic employment levels until 2025. At ReNew Mexico, we focus quite a bit on adding more and more renewable energy jobs to the existing energy job opportunities out there. But first, we are obviously in a pandemic, and I wanted to see from you, how has that impacted Lee County in terms of its overall economy and the job market? Is there anything you want to share in terms of the county's economic development strategy from a jobs perspective? And where are you finding kind of positive fertile ground despite these challenging times that we're in?
So I'm going to start with our baseline, which as of right now, this very second, is quite frankly a dumpster fire. Things are not good anywhere in the US, as we all know, but Lee County and a lot of the Permian Basin, quite frankly, took a 1-2 punch to the chin earlier this year. A lot of us, of course, talk about COVID, unfortunately, on a daily basis, but one of the things that a lot of folks have forgotten about is with the OPEC Plus deal earlier this year, when the Russians and the Saudis played havoc on the shale plays of the United States. And then of course, as we all recall, oil and gas went into the red for the first time since those numbers were tracked. It really caused havoc throughout the workforce of southeastern New Mexico, not only Lee County, but Eddy County, and even going over into Texas. So last year at this time, our unemployment rate was just under 4%. Right now, we are just over 15%. We are not the highest unemployment in the state, but we have had the highest rate of increase in unemployment claims. And as a lot of people might guess, a lot of that is coming from the oil and gas sector, especially because of how low the prices are. We do anticipate oil and gas in Lee County going through a K-shaped economic recovery. And for those of you, for those that may not know what I'm referring to, if you think of the letter K, which I just drew on the screen, which is probably backwards for all of you, there's going to be some industries that go up, which is the top part of the K, and there'll be some industries like non-essential, such as a retail boutique or your restaurants and other things that are going to continue to go down. So you're going to switch like this, with some of the economy continuing to improve as more people start to get on airplanes and travel, with a lot of our economy staying down here. That's where a lot of New Mexico will go, is in that K-shaped recovery. Where Lee County and some others in the Permian Basin will most likely also stay is in a U-shaped recovery. With the U-shaped recovery, we'll come down like this and we'll hover around here down at the bottom, where oil and gas will go up a little bit, we'll drop back down, go up a little bit and drop back down. And eventually our essential and non-essential economy will all start to go back up. The last time we saw a U-shaped recovery was in 1973, around the oil and gas crisis then. All of this to say is that when we suffer in southeastern New Mexico, the state's budgets suffer. Just like you, Ben, we were very excited to see that the financial projections were not as bad. And while I said things are definitely a dumpster fire, that does provide us a little bit of stability to know that things can improve, and they will start to improve. The markets do like that we're getting closer to a vaccine. The markets do like that with the vaccine, people will start traveling again for work, go on vacations, and do those types of things when it's safe to do so and be closer to folks again. One of the positives that's come out of this for us is that it will allow us to further diversify and bring in additional manufacturing opportunities. And the reason that I bring up those manufacturing opportunities is because that's really where our economic-based jobs are. The more that we can create in New Mexico, the more money that will stay in New Mexico. And to Arcelia's point earlier, the better job that we will do of ensuring that there is less brain drain in our state and more young New Mexicans will want to stay here. If you would have come to me 11 months ago and said, well, why aren't you working to diversify your economy? I would have said, I promise you, Ben, I'm trying, but I've got a couple factors working against me. Number one, everybody that was able to work and wanted to work in Lee County was working, and they were making good money doing so. Plus, we have a huge shortage of housing, not only affordable housing, but even housings for your C-suite level folks. People just weren't building homes because the demand was too great, because we couldn't get developers to come in, whatever the reason was. So let's say that I went to go pitch a company to bring in more of those economic-based jobs. They'd say, we love Lee County. You've got great incentives. New Mexico seems like a business-friendly state. You've got lots of land. You've got all kinds of resources. Do you have workers that can work in my factory? And I'd say, I sure don't. They're all working. And then they'd say, okay, well, we'll just bring workers with us. Do you have anywhere to put them? And I'd be like, yeah, I don't have any houses. So when you think through the idea of economic development and diversification, even though it seems like it's quite frankly the best idea in the world, it's also something that won't happen overnight, because you've got to think about transmission lines. Do you have access to broadband? Do you have housing for your workers? Do you have good school systems? So one of the things that the pandemic has helped us do, and that from the economic development side, is quite frankly to take a deep breath and kind of reorganize with our partners to say, where can we bring in more housing? How is broadband development going? Where can we start to pivot to more manufacturing-based jobs? All of those things have come together to help us figure out ways that we can better pitch different companies and new companies, especially as you hear more about the concerns and options around onshoring and reshoring, as more businesses start to move back from China and other places that might contribute to our economic base. And finally, we all know that New Mexico was quite frankly built for social distancing. We're a massive state. We've got a lot of room to grow. And quite frankly, there's not a whole lot of us right now. So as we look to find ways to entice people who might be interested from moving out of a New York City or Los Angeles and those types of things, New Mexico is well suited to attract some of those businesses that may not have been willing to look at us before. And to Ricky's point earlier, as we look to build out transmission and finding better ways to do that, we'll continue to need to work with the grassroots efforts like you guys are doing, and at the state level and local levels, to ensure that we have the incentives to bring in those companies when they're ready to invest and move to our area.
Thanks, Missy. That was super comprehensive, and one thing that you mentioned, raised a question in my mind, and I know it's a question of folks who are starting to jump into the Q&A, and we've got some advanced questions about this too. Is, you mentioned folks calling you and said, hey, do you have workers who can work in my factories? And I started thinking about training programs. And so as a follow-up, I'll start with Arcelia on this with the Rural Jobs Now initiative. But after that, I'll also open it up to Missy and Ricky to comment on with the training programs. And so I heard in advance from Andrew Swap, who's an instructor at the Mesa Lands Community College, about what kind of training programs are out there. How can those training programs work with the initiative we're talking about now, your community or your organization? We also got a question in the Q&A from Janine Solar, who is the Career Services Director at Western New Mexico University, about how can graduates find new opportunities in this field. And so I'd like to, Arcelia, start with you to talk about training programs. What have you found out there? What comments do you have about training programs, and how either folks who are transitioning from one sector to this sector, what do they need to basically arm themselves with in terms of training, but also people who are just getting into the this career or the employment field for the first time? Where do they start to make sure that as these jobs become available, they have trained themselves, or they're working with an organization or a group to make sure they're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. The good news is that there's thankfully a lot of programs available at the local colleges, the universities that offer these kinds of programs to help students who want to go into this field. That same study that I can actually link in just a minute in the chat that I mentioned earlier has a list of all these different programs. And then what they also found was that there's like a whole spectrum of availabilities from those who from in the clean energy industry, from those who don't require that much education to those that are like more advanced degrees. And they found that most of the demand for these clean energy jobs is actually middle ground, which requires high school and also for like not four-year college, but some like higher education. And I can link that as well. But yeah, thankfully, like there's a lot of programs that are available. There's local organizations. I just actually spoke to someone just yesterday who was doing amazing work down in Doña Ana County to make sure that students are aware of the programs available in their area. What's really needed is a more statewide cohesive effort to let students and all New Mexicans know about these programs that are available, because there's not really that effort going on right now. Yeah, like I mentioned, the one county is like doing a great job, but we really need to have, like what Missy mentioned, better broadband so that people who want to go into the field are able to work with more flexible hours to get the training that they need, as well as hands-on experience.
Thanks, Arcelia. Missy, anything to add on that front based on your experience in Lee County?
Sure. Super quick. And I'm sorry if you guys can hear a car alarm in the background. I hope it's not my car, but I'm not sure.
We hope it's not your car either.
Thank you. Two real quick things that we're very proud of in Lee County is, first of all, we do have New Mexico Junior College that has a phenomenal renewable energy component that they work with, but also Hobbs Municipal Schools has recently started building their career technical education high school. And through that CTE school, all high school students that go through the Hobbs Municipal Schools will at least have a class or two in that actual building, which is located on the Hobbs High School campus. They still get to play football, get to be in band, and all the other great extracurriculars that schools always provide. But what that CTE school will do is provide the opportunity for students to learn more about the energy sector, hospitality, STEM jobs, all those sorts of things. And with that in mind, for those that are graduating high school, they could go immediately into the workforce. They could go on to New Mexico Junior College to get a certificate or a 2-year degree, and they can also be prepared to go on to a 4-year university if that's the right track for them. We know that we're very fortunate to have the CTE school in southeastern New Mexico, and we look forward to that expanding throughout the state. But the more that we focus on career technical education, that will of course decrease the brain drain. And quite frankly, it makes our jobs as economic development gurus even easier, because the more that we can prove that our education is great throughout all of New Mexico at the Head Start level all the way up to our 4-year university level, the more people that will keep in state, but also attract new business and new companies to come to our area.
Thanks, Missy. I appreciate that. So Andrew from Mesa Lands Community College actually had a follow-up, and I love when people ask this question, which is there more community education needed with regard to this line of discussion on training programs? And when somebody says, how can we support your efforts? It's like music to my ears. So the answer, Andrew, is yes, you can. And I know what you're looking for in terms of linking your training program in one part of the state and the community with industry. And so that is actually a part of the mission of Read New Mexico, is making sure that the folks, because we're typically talking with folks on the ground in local communities, your type of education institutions and other stakeholders like that. But we're obviously working with organizations like Ricky's, who is talks with industry every day. We talk with industry on a regular basis, and part of our mission is being able to have the two meet in the middle in terms of sharing information. And so as Andrew, we get questions like yours from the community college. Part of our job is to make sure we take that question and we bring it to industry and say, hey, Mesa Lands Community College would like to share what they're doing. I'm sure industry would like to share what industry is doing with the community college, and create a forum like this one, like others, so that you two can talk. And so we are out there. We will share our contact information for all the panelists and the organization at the end of this, and put up a slide. And anybody who is interested in sharing that information, getting it to industry or getting it to other organizations who represent industry or have industry who are commonly at their kind of table having these conversations, please send that to us, because we will make sure it gets to the right place. Since we're an organization who is all about sharing information and education, the answer is certainly yes, we need more. That's why we're doing things like this Zoom event today. We do feel like, based on the outreach we've done, people have a pretty strong level of information about renewable energy development. I think thanks to a lot of our leaders in the state really kind of spearheading this. But there's always a little bit of a void, and we're definitely here to fill it. So I do appreciate the follow-up question. I'm going to throw one more question out for the panelists, and then we can use the remaining time for some questions that have come in through the chat. I really would, it's really a forward thinking, what are we going to see next year in terms of what you're focused on? And so, Ricky, why don't I start with you? What's 2021 look like for you? Do you have any predictions? We won't hold you to them, but what's your mission for next year, and just what do you expect to see that you're confident in sharing with us today?
It's interesting. Had we done this a year ago, we all would have said, here's what we think is going to happen in 2020. And I'm going to go ahead and guess we all would have been pretty darn wrong. So here's hoping that there's some wisdom in this crystal ball, some of which I think is pretty likely and some of which may be harder. Some of the things I feel excited about, in the last legislative session, New Mexico legislators passed House Bill 233, which was the Grid Modernization Act. And as part of it, the state has convened an advisory group to build out a grid modernization roadmap to be prepared, I think, by the end of this year and reported back to the legislature. And I've been a part of that grid modernization group. As I know, looking at the attendee list, many folks on here have also been part of that. I think that report and roadmap will be really informative for legislators seeking to take positive actions toward modernizing the grid. And the recommendations in that report are both on the sort of grid scale or transmission level, as well as in the distributed level, microgrids. It touches kind of how we as New Mexicans interact with our electricity, as much as it touches how our regulators allow for more thoughtful planning. So I think we'll see some good, strong recommendations coming out of that grid modernization roadmap, and I'm hopeful that we can see the state move forward on some of those recommendations. I think too, it'll be a big year for planning and seeing opportunities for the future. What I mean by that is PNM is working on its integrated resource plan, which is basically its 20-year look at what types of resources they will need to meet their demand. Similarly, El Paso Electric and Southwest Public Service also have their IRP processes underway. So we'll get a sneak peek into what the future looks like for our electric utilities, and as stakeholders, we'll be able to help inform that. Another exciting change on the horizon, as many have seen, there's a pending merger application between PNM, excuse me for my calendar alert, and Avangrid. So our largest utility in the state may look very different in a few years, and there will be a lot of discussions at the Regulatory Commission about that merger application this year. So a lot of big changes on the horizon. The last thing I would say, because I can't ever talk on a panel without talking about it, but I think the momentum for this regional transmission organization and unlocking regional electricity markets will be on the forefront of policymakers' minds, not just here in New Mexico, but all across the region and across utilities, because it will take a tremendous amount of coordination and thought leadership across state lines to make that happen. And everything I'm seeing indicates there's likely forward momentum next year.
Thanks, Ricky. Missy, what's next year look like for you?
First and foremost, getting our folks back to work, whether that's in the industries that they previously were employed in or new industries that can help them pay the mortgage and get their kiddos back in school and all those sorts of things. I also think that this will create a smarter New Mexico in regards to how do we best deal with regulatory concerns? How do we incentivize new companies to come to the region, and not just any companies, but the kind of companies that we want to see operating in New Mexico with high paying jobs and opportunities to expand. And finally, building off of that thought, attracting those types of companies that we want to see grow here. And as we become a smarter New Mexico, finding ways to increase our broadband resources, find new ways for transmission lines and other infrastructure. And I know that this phrase can be a little bit loosey-goosey because it means different things to all of us, but trying to ensure that we are a business-friendly state. And yes, we've got a lot of business in New Mexico, but how do we further incentivize and ensure that businesses can do business here and do so in a way that keeps our economy moving forward in a very stable way? But first and foremost, we've got to get people back to work. We've got to get our kiddos back in school. And then from there, as we work to become a smarter New Mexico, we can become a more diversified New Mexico.
Thank you, Missy. Arcelia, would you like to talk about 2021 in terms of the Rural Jobs Now initiative, and what do you see coming down the road?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to having more conversations now that everyone on this panel knows that I am not a robot. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to having more conversations about addressing these misconceptions and moving projects forward and just showing the benefits that they can have in our rural communities as well. And yeah, I know that there's probably going to be a very interesting legislative session, so I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen with that as well. Right now, we are in a crucial moment in history, but also with this transition that's coming up with expanding our energy sources and diversifying our economy. So I think right now we need to be just very mindful of anything that can hinder or make sure that we continue on the progress that we have set on in these last few years.
Thanks, Arcelia. I really appreciate that as well. So there's been great points made all around from the panelists. So again, I really appreciate that. So we're going to move to a little bit more of the Q&A. There have been a number of comments in the Q&A section of the Zoom event today. Probably more comments than questions. So I think there's going to be a fair amount of follow-up from us at Read New Mexico to you on some of those, particularly as it relates to training programs. Naturally, there's some questions. There's a question here from Lee Canner. Can wind and solar make up lost jobs from closing coal plants or shutting down oil rigs when, with regard to jobs in wind and solar being heavily in construction versus long-term jobs with regard to replacement energy? The one point I'd like to make there is that at Read New Mexico, and I know Missy touched on this a little bit with regard to the Energyplex, that we certainly see the mission of renewable energy projects in transmission as being very complementary of existing jobs that are out there in the current energy sector, and adding to them with opportunities. Our goal as an organization is not wholesale replacement of traditional jobs in energy. We want to make the pie bigger for New Mexicans in terms of those job opportunities. So this is definitely an additive effort, additive initiative. And so I wanted to make sure we responded to that too. Any of the other panelists want to touch base on any of on their question?
I'm happy to jump in briefly, Ben. I think it's
Yeah.
an important question and it's a hard question because, the point of building renewables for some may be to replace traditional fossil fuel generators. But to your point, this is a state where we have both and they will be adding. And to compare them one to one, I think that the real honest answer is probably no. There's probably not the same. Certainly one wind farm compared to one coal plant, you will not replace the same number of jobs. However, I do think it's encouraging. I'll use one example from this past year. As PNM went through its process at the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, for its replacement resource portfolio for the San Juan coal units. Essentially, as San Juan is retired, what do you replace that with? The commission approved a 100% renewable energy replacement scenario. So a couple of different resources, many of which are located in San Juan County and provide direct benefits to the county and to the school district. In that analysis, one of the major discussion points was the number of jobs in that replacement resource portfolio. So in the testimony, it was estimated that there would be over 1,000 construction jobs for the new facilities in this replacement package. And it was, I believe, 16 to 28 permanent jobs. And that's not a huge number, but it is a number. And I think the industry is trying to be very clear about what those jobs look like, what those jobs pay, and to give people the answers they need when they're making decisions about replacing fossil fuel generators as they come offline, because it is a balancing act, wanting to have economic development, wanting to put people to work, but also wanting to bring new projects online that meet the standards passed into state law. The last thing I'll say on this, and I can put it in the chat, but the New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority, RETA, released their transmission and storage study earlier this year, and they map out through 2032 what the expectations are for New Mexico. And what they predict for renewable energy and transmission is 3,700 jobs per year now through 2032. And then past 2032, they say 600 to 800 permanent jobs associated with this renewable and transmission development. So those are bigger numbers. And more than anything, I think having the information is good, but it's probably not a one-to-one replacement.
Thanks for adding there, Ricky. Appreciate that. There's one other question here before we'll have to close out. We're coming to the end of our time. David Vogel, I'm glad you think this is an excellent and highly informative conversation. We expect to have many more as we move forward. You had a question about whether Albuquerque or Bernalillo County participates in our coalition. So if you go to our website at renewmexico.org, you'll find our current partners. We have reached out to a number of different local municipal governments, but also you also see a fair amount of chambers of commerce. Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, for instance, was one of our first partners as well. And so we have reached out, and we don't necessarily have them as official partners. We are certainly interested in having them as official partners. I'm glad you're working on a solar array option that you mentioned. We'll get back to you on that. But Arcelia, as I mentioned, as a Renew Mexico field person, besides the Rural Jobs Now initiative that she leads, is very actively reaching out to those folks around the state. So the short answer is not yet, but we hope very soon. So David, thanks very much for your question. For those of you who have thrown in a comment and left a question in the Q&A, we will make sure that we follow up with you. We thank you for adding to the event with your question or with the issue that you brought up. We hope we've kind of covered a pretty diverse amount of issues around renewable energy project development and transmission. But we're at the end of our time, and I just want to thank our panelists, Ricky, Arcelia, Missy, really appreciate your time. I know you all are super busy, but terrific comments, and great to have your experience adding to the conversation today. As a final act of the webinar, I'm going to put up a quick call to action. If you're interested in standing up for the future of rural jobs in the clean energy industry, we invite you to consider signing our Rural Jobs Pledge, which we have also linked in the chat for you to see. I will share that now, and then I just want to make sure that everybody has a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks again for everybody who signed in, called in. And again, thank you to our panelists today. Great having you on.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate everybody.
Thank you, Ben.